There is a particular kind of manipulation that never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with pressure or obvious force. It arrives as warmth, as agreement, as the quiet feeling that someone finally understands you. And because it feels like connection, the mind doesn't raise its defenses, it opens. Most people believe they would recognize it. That belief is precisely what makes them vulnerable. The harsh truth about dark psychology is not that bad people exist. It's that influence in its most refined form is indistinguishable from sincerity. It moves through ordinary moments, a conversation, a gesture, a decision that felt entirely your own. The hidden manipulation you never notice isn't hiding. It's simply wearing a face you already trust. This is where we begin. There is a moment, unremarkable, easy to miss, when a decision stops being yours. It doesn't happen through force. It rarely announces itself as persuasion. It happens in the 3 minutes before the question is asked, in the sentence placed casually before the options are presented, in the silence after something generous was done for you, and now, almost naturally, almost inevitably, a request follows. Watch the meeting room. A colleague is about to propose an idea. But before they do, before the idea itself enters the room, they spend 3 quiet minutes elsewhere. Not arguing, not pushing, merely observing aloud that the alternative approach has had some complications lately, that another team tried something similar, that the results were well mixed. No one challenges this. It is stated as background, as texture. Then the idea arrives, and the room agrees, unanimously. Each person believes they have weighed the options and reached their own conclusion. One person in the room didn't speak. They watched instead, and what they saw was not a persuasive presentation. They saw the environment being built carefully, incrementally before anyone walked in. This is the psychology of pre-suasion, the manipulation of attention before the ask. What occupies the mind immediately prior to a choice shapes the choice itself, often more completely than the choice's actual content. The framing isn't the decoration around the decision. The framing is the decision. It is one of the more unsettling mechanisms of human behavior to recognize, not because it is rare, but because it is constant. The persuasive colleague who always speaks last, after the doubts have already been seeded. The partner who introduces a significant request after an evening of unusual warmth. The friend whose questions are framed as curiosity but are never on reflection neutral. Most people move through these moments without noticing the architecture. They experience only the conclusion, a feeling of agreement, of clarity, of having chosen, the sensation of free thought, intact. But the sensation of free thought is itself something that can be constructed. This is where the deeper discomfort begins, because the unsettling truth about covert influence, about the kind of dark psychology that operates not through dominance but through context, is that it does not feel like manipulation. It feels like thinking. It feels like arriving somewhere on your own. The most effective influence is the kind experienced as one's own inner voice. And so the question that tends to sit uncomfortably, which of your recent convictions arrived that way? Not through overt argument, not through pressure you could identify and resist, but through carefully arranged context. A conversation you had 2 days before a major decision, an article that happened to appear, a framing introduced so gently that it settled into your thinking like something you had always believed. Autonomy for most people is less a reality than a sensation. The feeling of choosing freely is real. What preceded it, what shaped the terrain before the feeling arrived, that is something far less examined. The one who said nothing in the meeting understood this. They were watching not the idea being presented, but the ground being prepared. Influence, at its most potent, is invisible. Not because it is hidden, but because it has been made to feel like the natural conclusion of your own reasoning. That is its architecture, quiet, structural, and entirely outside the frame you were given to look through. There is a particular kind of connection that feels different from the rest. Not louder, not more dramatic, just closer, more precise. As if the other person is reading a version of you that most people never bother to find. Watch it happen in a room. Someone new enters a conversation. Within minutes they are laughing at the same things, echoing the same cadence, leaning at the same angle. The person across from them visibly softens. Their posture opens. Their guard piece by piece dissolves. Nothing overtly false has occurred, and yet every beat of the exchange has been shaped by something the other person brought in deliberately. This is mirroring, and it is one of the quietest instruments of covert influence ever observed in human behavior. The mechanism is neurological before it is emotional. When another person reflects your speech patterns, your body language, your expressed values back to you, the brain does not register performance. It registers recognition, deep compatibility, the sensation of being understood without effort. Trust forms rapidly under these conditions, and trust once formed requires no further manipulation to be useful. What makes this particular dynamic is, when another person reflects your speech patterns, your body language, your expressed values back to you, the brain does not register performance. It registers recognition, deep compatibility, the sensation of being understood without effort. Trust forms rapidly under these conditions, and trust once formed requires no further manipulation to be useful. What makes this particular dynamic is so psychologically destabilizing is not that it is painful in the moment. It is that it feels like the opposite of pain. The colleague who becomes a confidant unusually fast. The romantic partner who seems to share every instinct, every quiet frustration, every half-formed belief. The mentor who always arrives with exactly the words you needed before you knew you needed them. These relationships carry warmth. They carry a sense of being genuinely seen. The dark psychology embedded here is not in the feeling. It is in the architecture behind it. Because mirroring, at its most deliberate, is not empathy, it is observation deployed as strategy. The skilled practitioner is not discovering who you are. They are cataloging you. Your insecurities become reference points. Your values become entry angles. The self you present in moments of vulnerability becomes in the wrong hands, a script someone else now holds. The psychological discomfort arrives not in the encounter but afterward, in the quiet, unsettling recognition that you cannot always distinguish the genuine from the constructed. That the person who seemed to understand you most completely may have simply been the most attentive student of your patterns. That intimacy and intelligence, in the absence of integrity, produce something that looks identical to connection. This is where the hidden motivations of human behavior become genuinely difficult to navigate. Not because people are uniformly dangerous, but because the same behavior reflecting, adapting, attuning is the foundation of both real empathy and sophisticated manipulation. The mechanism is identical, only the intention differs, and intention by design remains invisible. The brutal reality is this: the self we present to the world is also the self that can be reverse engineered. Every preference disclosed, every pattern revealed, every value stated aloud. These are not just expressions of identity. They are also data. And in the hands of someone studying rather than connecting, they become leverage. The question the mind eventually arrives at is uncomfortable in its precision. If someone mirrors who you are with perfect accuracy, if the feeling of being understood was entirely real, does the deliberateness behind it change what it was? Perhaps. Perhaps not. What changes is your awareness of the dynamic. And awareness, quiet and unglamorous as it is the only thing that cannot be reflected back at you. There is a pattern in high-stakes environments that most people notice but rarely examine. In a room where tension is present, a negotiation, a confrontation, a quiet standoff between opposing interests, the person who speaks most is almost never the most powerful. They are the most anxious. Watch closely. One person speaks at length. They explain their position, qualify it, then explain it again. They fill every pause with more words, as if silence itself were a threat to be managed. Across from them sits someone who does very little. They wait. They nod slowly, almost imperceptibly. When they finally speak, it is a single sentence, measured, unhurried. And something shifts. The room does not shift because the sentence was profound. It shifts because everything before it was silence. And silence, in the psychology of social dynamics, is rarely empty. What the talkative person revealed was not their argument. It was their internal state. The over-explaining is not persuasion, it is a map of insecurity. Every justification signals uncertainty. Every unprompted clarification exposes the need for approval. The person who spoke the most has also exposed the most: their anxiety, their self-doubt, the invisible pressure they feel to be understood. The one who said very little has revealed nothing. And in the architecture of influence, mystery carries more weight than transparency. This is the mechanism that most people intuitively sense but cannot name. Silence forces interpretation. When you withhold your reaction, the other person cannot calibrate against you. They are left to fill the void, and they will fill it with their own projections, their own fears, their own assumptions about what your stillness means. The silent party neither confirms nor denies. That ambiguity does not weaken their position, it amplifies it. They become in effect a psychological mirror, and what people see in a mirror is always themselves. Consider the executive who asks a question and then waits. Not impatiently, but with complete composure. The person responding begins to speak, then over-explains, then qualifies, stumbles into honesty. They had not intended to reveal, because the silence demanded it. The executive offered no pressure. The silence was the pressure. That is the distinction between covert influence and visible force. One is resisted, the other is barely noticed until its effect is already felt. Or the partner who responds to conflict not with escalation but with quiet detachment. Not coldness, detachment. The one who argues forcefully is operating at full emotional exposure. The one who remains still is, by contrast, unreadable. And the unreadable person holds a disproportionate position in any emotionally charged dynamic. Their calm is not neutrality, it is architecture. There is an internal audit that happens when this pattern becomes visible. You begin to recall conversations where you over-explained to someone who said very little, and how their silence made you say more than you had intended. You remember the colleague whose opinions carried unusual weight, not because they were always correct, but because they were rare. Scarcity creates perceived value. That principle does not only apply to objects. The quiet inversion this reveals is uncomfortable. In a world saturated with noise and performed confidence, the person who withholds reaction holds more psychological real estate than the person who fills every moment with presence. Restraint, in the hidden mechanics of human behavior, is not absence. It is the most deliberate form of control. The room does not react to the composed person. The composed person watches the room react. There is a particular kind of generosity that asks for nothing.
At first, in most offices, someone like this exists. They remember the small things, a difficult week, a forgotten birthday, the coffee order you mentioned once in passing. Their warmth feels unremarkable, even pleasant. You don't analyze it. Why would you? Generosity doesn't invite suspicion. That's precisely what makes it useful.
But there is a category of human behavior that operates beneath the surface of kindness. One that understands something most people do not. That loyalty doesn't have to be earned through honesty. It can be manufactured through debt, invisible debt, the kind that accumulates quietly, in small gestures until the moment it's called in. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like fairness. This is the architecture of manufactured loyalty, one of the more refined instruments of dark psychology and covert social control. Reciprocity is not a courtesy. It is a biological imperative, deeply encoded, almost impossible to override once activated. When someone gives to you time, attention, recognition, a quiet ledger opens inside the mind, not a conscious one. You don't decide to keep it, it simply begins, because the human psyche is wired to restore balance, to not be a burden, to be decent. The sophisticated manipulator understands this mechanism better than most people understand themselves. They don't ask for loyalty directly. They create the conditions under which loyalty becomes the only thing that feels right. Each act of generosity is a deposit. Each one narrows the psychological distance between giving and obligation. By the time the favor is requested, it doesn't arrive as a demand. It arrives as an obvious next step after everything they've done. The target doesn't experience coercion. They experience their own values, their gratitude, their sense of fairness, their decency. And that is the most precise expression of this particular manipulation. It doesn't override who you are. It borrows who you are. Your virtues become the mechanism. Consider the manager who distributes small recognitions. A public compliment, a flexible afternoon, a moment of visible support before asking for something that costs the team significantly. Consider the friend whose generosity intensifies during periods of your personal vulnerability and recedes when stability returns. Consider the partner whose warmth operates on a cycle you've never quite named, but somehow always correlates with a moment of potential conflict or departure. None of these people may be conscious architects of what they're doing. Some manipulation is learned, habituated, absorbed from environments where conditional warmth was the primary currency of human relationships. The behavior repeats not from cold calculation, but from a kind of emotional muscle memory, which makes it no less structural, no less real in its effects. The quiet question this lens invites, not paranoia, but precision, is simply, whose generosity has always seemed to arrive before a request? Which relationships in your life were built on genuine connection, and which were engineered with the same deliberateness as any other form of psychological leverage and hidden influence? The answer, when it comes, tends to arrive slowly and without much noise. That's usually how the deepest realizations do. The manipulations that shape us most completely are the ones we never named. They didn't arrive as threats. They arrived as warmth, as loyalty, as the quiet certainty that someone understood us better than most. That is the brutal reality of dark psychology. Not that deception exists, but that it so rarely feels like deception at all. Some of what we call trust was architecture. Some of what we call connection was careful observation turned inward. Some of what felt like choice was a room someone else had already arranged. This isn't cause for paranoia. It's cause for a different quality of attention. Slower, quieter, less quick to name a feeling before examining where it came from. Awareness, in the end, is the one thing that cannot be manufactured for you. Everything else can.